Hi, it's me again, Gab from One Code Camp, and in this video, we'll be talking about a cyclic block of code called loops. For that, to start our discussion, let's open up our code editors and get to coding. Alright, so to start, let's first discuss what loops are. So we use loops to shorten codes that are repetitive, and let's have an example of that. Let's create our JavaScript file, or just name it script.js, right there. And when I say repetitive, these are things that we can just write once and then run for a couple of times. Here's an example of a loop. So this is specifically a for loop. It's what we call a for loop. And it's going to run 10 times. And I'm going to explain all of these expressions to you in a minute. And this loop will run this console.log hello one coders 10 times and print it in our terminal. So let's run this code right there. And let's see that again in action. There it is. So we've run our code. We've run that console.log 10 times with just this 3 lines of code. So that's what loops are. But we're not going to use loops here in our discussion as just that, something that is used for printing. We're going to use it to iterate through an array. So before we can use these loops, of course, we need to discuss what its part are. So let me remove this. And first is the keyword for, because we're using a for loop. And then this for loop can actually accept 3 optional expressions, and they're all separated by a semicolon right here. So the first expression lets you declare a variable that will serve as your counter. Usually that's a let I equals, there it is, let I equals 0. That means 0 right there. That means you want a counter that will start in 0. So if you try to count forward, this will set as your limiter later as well. For the next expression, this expression will be checked before your loop is run. So this will check a condition, and if this condition is still true, then we will keep running your loop. But once this condition returns the value of false, then that's when we will break out of our loop. And usually what we declare in here is a comparison of our counter, the one that we declared here, and then how many times we want it to run. Let's say we want it to run 10 times. I'll just say I less than 10 because we started with 0. So as long as this I variable is less than 10, we're gonna keep running through our loop as long as this value is true. And for the last expression, this will actually be the increment or a decrement, or this will serve as something that will add to our counter right here. And usually if we want our counter to increment by 1, we just add I plus plus here. That means for every iteration of our loop, for every run of our loop, this counter will increase by 1. But it doesn't have to be 1. It can be 2. We can increment it by 15 if we want to. But that's gonna end our code after just one run. So let's say we want it to run 10 times, and that means that we're gonna have to increment our counter for just 1 every time. And then we can do whatever we want here inside this code. This is where we will put the codes that we want to be run for every iteration of our loop. Since we've mentioned that we're going to use these loops to iterate through an array, or to iterate through any iterable component for that matter. So let's create an array first. Let's say const, and let's use the fruits array again. And it's going to be mango, kiwi, apple, banana, figs, lime. I'm running out of fruit ideas. It's gonna be a lemon. Some strawberry, Well, how many do you have here? We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I need 2 more. So that will be a pear and an orange. There it is. Make sure that everything is written properly. And we'll still put our semicolon right here, even though it's not required. So let's say we want to print out all of the parts of our fruits array and our console. Yes, we do have the toString methods for an array, but for the sake of discussion, let's use our for loop to print through it. So for that, let's use console.log and then the fruits. And remember how we can access an element of our array. We use an index, the indexing method, or we can use the .at method, but for simplicity, we'll use the indexing here. And since we have a counter that runs from 0 up to our limiting condition here, we can actually use that to indicate our index here, since our array has an indexing system that starts with 0. So let's put I here, right there, and let's see it in action. So there is a part of our array all printed in one line. So that is how we use the for loop to iterate through our array. So we have other types of loops as well, which we will discuss next. So again, as a recap of our for loop, we use the for keyword, and then the first expression is run once, not as many times as our loop. Then it checks for this condition first, and if it's true, it runs the code block, and then after every run of our code block, we run the third expression, but before we run the code block again, we check for the second expression again to check for the condition, if it's still true. And if it is, then we'll go through the code block, and then the third expression, and the pattern repeats again. So another loop that we will discuss is the while loop. Let me put a comment here. That is the while loop. It's kind of similar to the for loop, except you don't have this much expressions that you declare in the parentheses. So let's see that. While, and then the only expression that you'll put here is the condition that is needed to run our code block, or that is the second expression right here for our for loop. So let me comment this out so it doesn't run when we run our code. So let's say I less than 10. But remember, in the for loop, we declared that I inside the condition or inside the parentheses. But in while loop, we don't have that expression. So what we're going to do is we're going to declare our counter outside of the while loop equals 0 right there. And then we will do our code block inside here. So let's just keep on printing individual elements of our array. That's fruits, and then the index again. Now, another important thing to remember when using while loop is to put a delimiter, or something that will break our while loop, that will take us out of this while loop. Because if we don't, remember we set this counter to 0, this counter I to 0, but then this value is never changing because we don't have any lines here that will change that for us. Even if we run this code, the value of I will still be 0, and therefore this condition will forever be true. And if we run this, our application will crash because we're going to run out of memory to store this variable. So for that, we have to declare a code here that will change that counter and will at some point break us out of our loop. So that's a while, and let's try to run that. And there it is, just like what happened in the for loop right here. We also iterated through our array and printed each individual element. So that is a while loop. A variation of this while loop is something that we call the do while loop. It's almost similar, except you put in the keyword do here first, and then your code block, and then after your code block is where you put your while condition. right there, while, and then this is where we check for the condition. Let's say we will use the same condition at the top. So that's I less than 10. So it's almost similar, except there's a do right here. So what's the difference if they're almost the same? With while loop, you check the condition first, and if that's true, then that's the only time that you run your code block. But with a do while, you're going to run the code block first, and then check for the truth of this condition after running that code block. So a do while loop is guaranteed to run at least once. And in a while loop, if it is not, if the condition is not met, then it doesn't need to run the code at all. Let's see that in action. And this time, we will only print maybe every alternate, every other element of our array. So instead of I++, let's iterate it by 2. It's gonna be I plus equals 2, so that we only print every other element of our array. So let's run this code. There it is. So we have mango, apple, figs, lemon, and pear. We printed out 5 elements of our array instead of the whole 10 because we jumped at increments of 2 in our counter right here. So again, we need to include a counter so that we can break out of our loop at one point. But let's say that this condition is already false to begin with. So let's say while, in fact, I think you can put in a false right here already. And there you go. We still have this output of mango in our console, and that's because even if we already set the condition to false, it doesn't matter what the condition is, it's already false. Right here, we gave it a value of false already. But what happened was this do block was still run. This code block right here ran still. And that's the difference between a do and a do while. Now the for loop also has its own variation. So let's put some notes here. This is the do while loop. And I'm going to comment this one out. For the variation of the for loop, we have the for in loop. For in right there. And the difference here is that we use the length of our iterable component, in this case our array, as the delimiter or the point of comparison for our counter. So let's see that in action. So we still use the for keyword, and then in our parentheses, let's say we will put in here the variables in our array. So we declare our variable. So let's say let fruit. So we have a variable named fruit in, and then our iterable component, in this case, that's our array called fruits. So for every fruit in that fruit array, we're going to print it out. So let's put that right here. And in here, of course, that's our array. And for the index, since we did not set any I variable as a counter, we actually declared this fruit as our counter, this fruit variable. So we will use that as our index right here. And let's see that in action. There it is. These are our fruits right here. And it's printed out again, one element at a time. So that is how we use the for in variation of our for loop. There's no need for us to declare 3 separate expressions. Everything in here, all of that 3 expressions was done in here. So that's our counter, our condition, and our incrementation of the counter, done all in one statement. We have another variation of our for loop, which is the for of loop. Second note here is the for of right there. So the syntax is very similar with our for in loop, But instead of having a counter, you're in the for of, you were already representing the actual element itself right here. So let me demonstrate that. So that's for let fruit of fruits. And then instead of using the indexing method, we're already representing each individual element right here. So let's try to print that. That's console.log and then fruit. So that's how it is with the for loop, with the for of loop rather. So let's comment this out, and so this will be our only active code that will run. Let's run that, and there it is. We did not use the indexing method. We just used the variable itself to represent each individual array element. So let's see what will happen if we use that in our for in loop. So let's comment this and then uncomment this. And then instead of using the indexing method, let's use fruit right here. And let's see what's going to be our output there. Instead of having our individual array element, we actually got our counter right here. That's because with the for in loop, you get this variable represents a counter instead of the actual individual parts of our iterable element. Let's put this back properly. And that is how we use for loops and its variation, the for in and for of, the while loop along with the do while loop to iterate over our some iterable components. Now, using loops aren't limited to iterating through an iterable component. We can also use our loops to perform a repetitive computation. Let's say we want to get the to get a number up to the 10th power. We want to get all of its answers. Let's say we want 2 raised to 2 and then 2 raised to 3, 2 raised to 4 up to the 10th power. So let's try doing all of that using our loops. So we're going to use a for loop. In this case, let's declare our number n right here, and in this case let's just declare it as 2, and then we're gonna declare the exponent here, and of course this isn't really the exponent. We're just using this as the number that will be used to multiply the increasing number by itself. And since we don't want this number to change, we want this to still be 2 even after every run of our loop, but our container number right there will change. Let me just demonstrate for better discussion. So let's declare our counter here, and let's declare it 0. And then since we want to get up to the 10th power, let's say that I less than 10, and then I plus plus. That means our code will run 10 times. Of course, we want to get 10 raised to 0, raised to the first power first. So let's print that log n. We're going to print out n, and then of course we need to get its square, its cube, and so on. And for that, we'll declare the new value of n as itself times whatever number it is that we're getting the power of. In this case, we're getting 2. And let's try to run our code. There it is. So 10 raised to 1 is 2, raised to 2 is 4, raised to 3 is 8, raised to 4 is 16, and so on and so forth. And that also works even if we just change this value right here. Let's say we want to get 5. So that's 5, 25, 125, 625, and so on and so forth. So that's how we use loops for our repetitive computations. So I hope you learned a lot about our loops for this video, and in our future video we will be learning how to use all of the learnings that we've got so far, especially including these for loops in an exercise. So thank you so much for watching this video, and we hope that we can see you again in another tutorial. Thank you so much.